Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I'm your host, John Jewett.
And I'm your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. The best and the worst PEDs on prep for muscle retention. This will be our last segment of muscle retention throughout a contest prep. We hit nutrition, we hit training, we hit cardio, and now finally we're going to get into PEDs. And we thought it would be fun to go from our, maybe like our, was it David Letterman countdown, like top 10, but we'll do our top 5, but actually hitting some ones that could be problematic all the way down to our best. So if you already have in mind what your top one might be, put it in your mind. We'll see if you're correct. Luke, shall we start? And we'll hit with our number 5 spot. First, coming in at...
Go ahead.
Thyroid hormone.
Yeah, love it. Oh my goodness. The epitome of fear-mongering within contest prep for the newly initiated into prepping typically, I think is an integral part of dieting and combating adaptations from dieting from like a contest prep perspective. I think it's baseline understanding of physiology to see the need that arises in the majority of clients that are contest prep. But I guess the question is like, are we concerned with replacement therapy and tissue retention? And I think the question is how high does the dosing get? Because there is potentially some evidence showing that, dosing higher than 50 micrograms of T3 could potentially lead to issues with tissue retention. Replacement therapy dosing obviously is not going to be getting up to 50 micrograms. So if we're going to keep thyroid therapy within replacement ranges, I don't see this being an issue from a tissue retention standpoint.
Yeah, I think you're still balancing the equation of trying to keep someone metabolically optimized so they don't have to diet on crazy low food and really, really high cardio. I think you might run into someone having that problem. Then like it's last minute, like, well, let's add in the T3. And then they're already in a bad environment to just lose a lot of tissue and then throw that on top of it. Could maybe push them on top of the edge because you're right. Like, at least evidence wise, like once you push into this 50 microgram spot, and it's funny that a lot of times it's always, you hear 50 micrograms, but it's irrelevant to body weight. Like you have like a bikini girl that might get that, or the 300-pound bodybuilder that might get that. Extremely different cases in that instance, but going beyond like into super physiological thyroid amount, that's when you really start skewing the ratio of like, absolutely thyroid increases protein synthesis coming from a low level. It also increases protein catabolism, but it really skews into protein catabolism going to that hyperthyroid level. So you have to be considerate when you are dosing thyroid, like what is the body weight of this individual and where you're going to be starting out. And you might even bring in the caveat that maybe T3 isn't always the best choice and that you might need to be starting someone on T4 and let their own body like partition towards T3, giving them a much less likely chance to go into that hyperthyroid state.
Yeah. And I think there's value in monotherapy, but I think there's also more value, in my opinion, in dual therapy as well within this setting. I think, especially as you see someone adapt across a contest prep, potentially T4 to T3 conversion lowering, I do tend to lean now pretty heavily towards dual therapy with implementation. But either way, from a tissue retention standpoint, thyroid therapy is not going to be the root cause of your issue if you keep it within replacement ranges and don't push someone into being hyperthyroid. So let's not, blame a scapegoat here of like, I lost all this tissue on prep. It had to be the thyroid hormone. It's like, well, if it was dosed appropriately, it probably wasn't. You probably just put a prep in place that was too high a rate of loss. You lost performance retention across the prep. And you weren't able to retain that tissue as a result.
It's not to say that it doesn't happen. Like we've seen people using 100, 150 micrograms of T3 a day, which is, it's wild. And if you're also someone that's not enhanced as far as anabolics go, that's where you likely could very much run into that issue. I think even if you are enhanced, you shouldn't need more than like a physiological amount of thyroid to stay optimized. And we have other tools that we can utilize to drive that fat loss aspect without coming into losing the potential to lose even muscle or tissue. And maybe that brings us to our number 4 spot. And coming in at number 4 is injectable L-Carnitine. Probably wouldn't have thought about that one to come in.
the most overrated drug in contest prep.
Yeah, it is. I think a lot of times we have a lot of educators now that get really, well, we all do. We get excited about mechanistic data, physiological pathways, and seeing all these pathways of like, wow, this will drive this process or this process. But then you have to scope back, and when you actually implement them with your clients and see the impact, it turns out to be, sure, it drives all these pathways that should lead to this robust effect, but then it just kind of falls short, and you don't really see it having that much of an impact visually. Now, maybe long-term, small aspects will, but yeah, injectable L-Carnitine, it does have a component around potentially making, for one, if you're using androgens or growth hormone, making that more effective. Even in improving recovery aspects, there's a component around, utilizing it to where you'll spare muscle glycogen during your cardio, initially petitioning into more fat oxidation during, and then you'll have this glycogen preserved for your actual resistance training. So it's kind of the ideal situation. That's all great. It just doesn't pan out to being a drastic difference if, say, someone is, your big ticket items, like, right, you're doing a ton of cardio, you have a low calorie diet anyway, like L-Carnitine's not going to all of a sudden just revamp a poor program to begin with. Not to say it doesn't have some impact, but again, it's just, I think, very overrated, but it could be a tool to use.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's certainly valuable within a contest prep for the people that have ease of access. It doesn't cause too much pip with those people. And yeah, it's pretty easy to plug in. And it's a rather have it in than not have it in type of drug for me. It's like, if you have access to it, we're not seeing any issues. I'd rather it be in play, but it's not going to be the main one I obsess over, making sure that we have in play for a contest prep in regards to tissue retention for sure.
Once you're like a enhanced bodybuilder and experienced along these lines, and you have already multiple injections that you're doing, it simply becomes an ease of use aspect. Like, hey, how much is this going to make a difference? Because these shots are a literal pain in my entire body and not just my ass. So it's like, well, okay, if we could just avoid one less shot, because sub-Q in prep, it leaves nodules and knots. And when you're trying to take pics and stuff, you just like, it's not what you want. And then for the volumes too, then intramuscular, knotting up and having to train, that's also the problem. So I think for females, where we could maybe get more out of it from our non-androgenics, and also being like the androgens being a higher risk, like maybe that is something we would utilize more. And they're not going into those problems of using high injection volumes like the big bodybuilder might be. We might lean more into that because of its profile. However, if you're a larger bodybuilder and you're also using the big compounds that can make a big difference, then it might be one to table if you're running into issues with PIP and just usability.
Yeah, I would 100% agree, which I would tend to transfer that into a lipolytic I really enjoy using within a contest prep with our number 3 spot in Clenbuterol.
All right. Clen. So does have like, again, this is one where you can look at not only mechanistic data, but actually human data outcomes, where it does decrease. It has areas where it can increase like phosphorylation of mTOR and actually increase protein synthesis in a fasted state in a human being, which and even decrease muscle protein breakdown too, increase muscle contractions, increase force output in turn. So it can even improve training performance. Now, is it the main tool to utilize for building muscle retention and training performance? No. But there's a component where it contributes along to those lines. It's still our main compound, where what is its main purpose? It's a lipolytic, right? It increases adipose tissue breakdown. So that's still its main role. However, as a secondary role, it has a little bit of aid for muscle retention.
Yeah, 100%. And I think understanding primary indication and secondary indication for drugs or compounds is going to be huge just in regards to this whole discussion, because efficacy at which it operates is typically relative to primary indication or secondary. So I think it's definitely something that you're going to be using within majority of contest preps, unless someone is contraindicated to have like cardiovascular based issues where they can't. Then we're going to potentially, or we're going to see it as a part of the contest prep situation. But for those that are contraindicated where they can't use it, it's still not going to be our primary source of tissue retention from a PED standpoint.
I think potentially secondarily, indirectly, it could cause greater muscle retention, because we have preps where, and I'll put it in earlier for females a lot of times when you have the client that's already kind of low food, higher cardio, and to preserve that level of food is in turn going to preserve their training a lot better. So rather than just keep doing more cardio, lowering food, and we only save Clin to the last 6 weeks of prep because I don't know why, we put that in earlier, and that way we leverage that. We keep their food higher, their cardio lower, and they're fueled better for training. They're less fatigued from all the cardio, and we balance that energy equation out to where they lose fat and they have better muscle retention in turn. So I think as an indirect tool, it can work well for muscle retention, but its direct mechanistic aspects, we still have some better ones to drive that process with. Which maybe that rolls into our number 2, huh?
Number 2, we're burning through this.
I know we are. Should we slow it down as we can expand? Let's go
keep going and going. Oh goodness.
Well, I think the later ones might give us some better explanations. So
yeah, for sure. Let's go into number 2. What's our top 5 drug list? Number 2.
Number 2 comes in at growth hormone. All right. Yes,
lovely.
So interesting enough, I think growth hormones aspects on prep are probably one of the. It's hard. I go back and forth between, we want more. We had this conversation, right? If you had to pick it only during prep or only in off season, which ones would you pick? And I think it's just could be tolerated more on prep because of getting leaner, and the water retention might just be coming across as more fullness over actually blurring your visuals, like when you're too fat in the off season. However, when you're in the off season, then you might not have to use as much like steroid, and you leverage growth hormone. So you weigh it all out. You try to come up with the best situation for the client, for the result, and lowering the risk. But anyway, for our prep situation with growth hormone, absolutely can improve muscle retention, mainly through its roles, potentially some roles directly through growth hormone action. Because we see like in individuals with, we go to the extreme, acromegaly, they are extremely lean individuals and have higher muscle mass. And when you correct that growth hormone excess, they actually lose muscle mass and gain body fat. Yep. On the opposite end of the spectrum, someone's that's deficient, when you replace growth hormone, will actually get leaner and gain muscle mass. So just through like its application, it absolutely does improve muscle mass, maybe more so through its mechanisms of like IGF-1 and directly impacting protein synthesis and decreasing protein breakdown. But in turn, we also have growth hormone, which is breaking down, mobilizing body fat, and just overall, you're shifting this huge partition away from body fat and towards muscle mass. So it's really is one of these ultimate recomping agents, and has great application for both. It's like, do you implement it for fat loss or more for muscle retention and building? It's like you can make a great case, kind of go either way. But being such a low risk item, it's one, like once you're at that point to run year round, but it definitely would come in at my number 2 spot for prep.
Yeah. Especially just from like a synergistic perspective, like assuming we aren't, crashing estradiol across a prep as well, just from like a not knowing of estradiol's role potentially in, which I think that could be even a conversation as well, as what's estradiol's role in, tissue retention and skeletal muscle retention and performance and things along those lines. But, from a synergistic perspective, I just think the role of growth hormone to IGF-1 axis in general, like the whole axis, I do think is a large leverage piece within prep to help with tissue retention. not to mention like the lipolytic effects that we're going to see as well. So I guess the question I have for you, just because we've been talking off camera on it, is we've been going back and forth on like dosing a bit and like administration. Have you formulated thoughts around that, or?
Are you ready for my like master symposium on
guys, I hope y'all are ready for this PD module redo, because oh my God, this thing is going to be monstrous.
We're going through this quick 15-minute podcast to now like
a lecture.
It's just a lecture on growth hormone. So, well,
GH for dummies. Let's do it that way. GH for dummies.
Right. Well, I'll leave this a simple aspect around like what we're talking about for conversation.
Yeah.
Is there was some there's a study out there looking at intravenous administration of growth hormone, and at some point of this dosage, there's a peak in these fatty acids that come, I'm simplifying this way down, the fatty acids in the blood. And so it was said, well, if you go beyond this amount of growth hormone, which again, it's intravenous and we don't do growth hormone intravenous. So you're then extrapolating how much sub-Q would that need to be. And then also making the assumption of that those amount of fatty acids in the blood also mean you're losing body fat. And based on those numbers, it used to be said like, hey, around 2 IUs kind of maxes out your ability to lose body fat at that dosage. So the idea to use maybe multiple dosages throughout the day, or use this right before your fasted cardio. Now, if we actually, what matters, again, this is looking at just little acute variables. That's not what we should look at. We should look at a whole human person and do they lose body fat over X amount of weeks? And there's some cool studies looking at, and I think this is all in women, I believe, 7 IUs versus 14 IUs per day over X amount of time. Again, I got to review the study to see, but basically more did more. So once they got to 14 IUs, they still lost more body fat over 7 IUs. And this was all taken at nighttime. So if we were to have the assumption that only 2 IUs maxes out fat loss, then 7 IUs and going to 14 IUs would be completely pointless. But when we actually look at the data of how it's applied in people over time, it still seems more does more. So that's a brief takeaway. But just seeing, hey, fatty acids are in the bloodstream, that doesn't translate always to what does that mean for actual lipolysis and an outcome of fat loss? Because growth hormone and IGF-1 is doing a way more than just putting fatty acids in the bloodstream. So that's where that statement came from. And I think it's just a little bit short-sighted off looking on one study and not this big picture. So, and off a lot of this data, well, hey, take your growth hormone at night. It's still going to be in your system for a long duration because a sub-Q shot, you have a peak in growth hormone like 3 to 4 hours later. And then it continues in your system for like 12 and some people up to 20 hours. So if you woke up for your fasted cardio and you took your growth hormone shot, 30 minutes later, I'm doing my cardio, you haven't even got to the peak yet of when you're putting these fatty acids in the bloodstream. So that's when you get to the point of like, hey, timing is not going to be quite as important for trying to nail it with your fasted cardio and growth hormone. And we're getting to our conclusions of, hey, maybe taking it all night would have your best application. Where you'll find this out on is when I update the PED lectures in J3U, and you can come and learn all about it, which will be great. So I'll
leave it there.
I'm going to leave it there, Luke. Thanks for opening up the can of worms.
Sorry, I had to. We've been talking off camera, and I need more because we go back and forth via text, and then it gets lost in translation. So, I think the big takeaway here is like, if feasible from an access perspective and affordability perspective, growth hormone should absolutely be a component of stack design in order to help with tissue retention is the primary takeaway. And is it the main thing that's driving tissue retention? I would probably argue that it's not. We still got to look at all these other variables. But I think we could probably get a little bit more on that discussion as we go into spot number 1. And I think that's going to be a pretty big, more of a lever puller in regards to this discussion.
Yeah, I know everyone, you have it in your mind, and it's just like, it's the obvious one, isn't it? So coming in our number 1 spot is anabolic androgenic steroids, of course. Their main role
has to be.
their main role. That's what they do. That's what they've been used clinically, is to retain tissue or build tissue. So their main direct role is working on that androgen receptor, driving all their processes that lay down protein into muscle. So that is going to be our number one, also with the highest risks that come along with it. And I think we could break down this a little farther, Luke, because you brought up estradiol, and Luke is saying that he's running a bunch of estradiol in his preps. And Luke, is estradiol your number one spot?
No,
No, it's not.
Jesus Christ.
So, but I think with that being said, testosterone is a base, and it creates a lot of the synergies that go along with the other compounds that we have brought up, with estradiol influencing growth hormone, IGF-1 axis, and running this too low, you might have limitations in all kinds of things, your ability to sleep, your ability to lose body fat. But then it's finding the sweet spot too, because running it too high could be problematic on its own. So, but testosterone, regardless, would be the base to create all those synergies and also the protective aspects that it brings for all organ health as well. And I don't know if you want to differentiate any of the other ones, but I mean, there's a few like shining anabolics that can really stand out on the muscle breakdown side.
We can talk about the standouts. I mean, I think the key from an anabolic androgenic steroids is, what is the compound load needed for the client to retain tissue across the prep relative to the variables of how much tissue does the person carry and how smooth is the prep going. And I think this is so important to understand, because this changes the need for the same athlete. The athlete did
look at that.
They don't. This is the biggest part of androgen load on a contest prep. I made a post on social media that basically, in short, said you don't need as many drugs in prep as you do in all season. Some people were like celebrating, some people were blasting me.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's provide context. That context is always relative to how smooth that contest prep is going. Under the assumption that the prep is well planned, runs a normal rate of loss, you're ready early, and you're not having to push someone at a rate that is should not be expected, it's probably going to take less compounds to retain tissue. Okay. That's not true for everyone. There are preps that require more androgen load to retain tissue because of the rate at which you have to run the prep. And that variable largely drives the need for the client. And I think that's an important thing to understand before we go into like shining PEDs within that, because this whole conversation of like tissue retention within prep, it all, again, every podcast we've done, it's always came down to how fast are you running the rate of loss? How well are you managing fatigue? How well are you managing training performance? That tells you what the need of all these other variables are. And then you dose it according to the need of the client. And so that's where, like, sure, I get that maybe that was a general statement on social media, but it was under that assumption that prep was ran smoothly. And that's where a lot of that logic starts to come from.
I've been pigeonholed for the same thing as well. And there are people out there, they're like, yeah, I feel like I've been able to use less over the years and get more out of it. And I think that's even where I think some people are taking that away. Well, how are you getting more out of less? And I don't think that's it. It's like, as you keep bodybuilding, and you said something here, like your training performance is like better managed, you're becoming a better bodybuilder on all fronts, right? So prep should get better over time because you learn how to do all this stuff better. You better manage your routine. Maybe you're advancing in life as well. You're getting in a more like financially stable situation where you have that free time, relaxation time to prioritize recovery. You're learning how to train better. You're learning how to implement your diet strategies better and manage hunger better, and all those things that add up, the big ticket items, to where maybe you do use a little bit less drug because the other things are so much better that outweigh it. And it's not that you're getting more out of the less drug, the direct effect of the drug is the drug, but you're doing all the other things right. And in turn, we don't need to fill in that milligram total is high. Now, what Luke was just speaking to is that other person that's never learned to do those things. And it's always the drug has to be in place. And you also get the component from what's been passed down time from time is that you here's X protocol from whichever coach that gives to whatever pro, and is just way over the top. And you keep passing that around to where like, well, all of a sudden that's the norm, that we just use a ton of drug on prep, and there's no rationale brought into how you're assessing that drug need. It goes back to what Luke just said about, it's about gym performance. So over time, if you really pay attention to your gym performance, this is going to dictate how much compound you would really need, and challenge yourself of trying to improve all your other variables to bring about that improvement in recovery and training performance before you just pull the drug lever.
Yep.
Because that's where you find great coaching, is they're assessing all those areas and trying to pull that more out of you. And where you find poor coaching is that the update this week is add in XYZ drug. It's without any questions attached to it around how is your training, how is your sleep, what does your nutrition look like, all those things where a good coach should really shine and pull that out of you.
Yep, 100%. Now, let's assume these variables and let's get into some of the shining stars. Would you kind of categorize outside, what we're using for general compound load, like DHT derivatives and test? Probably the three categories drugs I would point out would be Trenbolone, halotestin, and then I would toss in for acute performance orals, and we could talk about oral of choice, right? But would those be kind of the three categories, like prep shining stars that get implemented in a place that are important for tissue retention?
Yeah, I guess just our briefer mentions, right? Like Trenbolone has some unique aspects to it that also, it's the good and the bad of Trenbolone. It has a lot of influence around cortisol, and in turn, makes it pretty neurotoxic, but also in turn is great for tissue retention and lowering muscle tissue breakdown. And so you've started to probably say, like, on a milligram basis, all these things build muscle relatively pretty close, but some have differentiations from side effect profiles, but maybe even from muscle retention aspects, from lowering protein breakdown through their non-genomic actions like Trenbolone. So through influence on cortisol, you decrease muscle protein breakdown and can make it kind of the shining one in muscle retention on a prep. Then, outside of that, we could look at some orals just because they are usually those last ones that we can add in. They're fast acting. They can improve gym performance quickly. And when it's a time when, hey, we can't wait 3-4 weeks for this injectable to play out to increase serum level, an oral can go in quickly, which I think he brings to your point of Anavar being probably one of the most benign oral steroids to be utilized for that purpose. However, some people, like, there's lots of orals to choose from. Halotestin has its own kind of unique properties, and we're speaking off camera how it also has some influence around cortisol. We won't go into some nerdy shit. It's fine. But probably why it also might make you feel a little bit more agitated on its influence on cortisol. Probably the same reason why Trenbolone does as well. Now, I will add on to that is that just because we said Trenbolone and Halo, and you're like, oh, sweet, I know my next drug's for prep, that if something takes away your ability to sleep, train, or eat, those are your big ticket items to muscle retention, then that dose or that drug is not worth it. So if you're on Tren and Halo and you're cranky, you're like, I got the right stuff, but I only sleep 2 hours a night and I'm so wired all day. That might be more problematic and drive more fatigue than just lowering your dose, or maybe don't use Halo, use Anavar as your oral of choice. So again, it's finding that, what that person needs and how do you manage all the variables best you can to retain tissue and get them on stage, peeled out, all the above, winning shows. So, yeah.
And I do want to clarify a statement I made. So I did separate out Halo from the other orals for a reason. One, the cortisol action that was previously mentioned, but two, access to real halotestin, I think is a big conversation to be had from a coaching perspective of where that's why I separated it out from a thought process perspective, because I'm a bit quicker to deploy Anavar or not any other oral, but a couple other orals within that conversation for tissue retention in the acute setting. So using it acutely for pre-training, and using that as a primary performance retention tool within a contest prep. And I will lean on that quicker than I do halo from the reality of getting real halo from that perspective. So that's why I do separate it out when I'm kind of talking like these shining stars.
Yeah. And even when we're speaking to like drug selections, it's not just what is the best fit for the person. Like sometimes it's the best fit's also the one you need to make sure is going to be real. And if we can lean into things that are like US farm grade, like that would be wicked if we could do it. If you were running Test and Anavar from US Pharmacy and you had access to like Bayer or like Rimabolin and like real primo, like, yeah, that's all great and ideal. So maybe that happens, you know, but it's not always the case. So then you're kind of left with, well, which UG product do we have tested, or which UG product is maybe the most liable to not be fake? And Halo falls into that one it's very expensive and it usually is most liable to be fake. Maybe you just get some Winstrol instead or something, or you get something way off. So maybe better choice is to go with a different compound. Or if you have the choice between UG Halo and farm grade Anavar, it's like, yeah, I'd probably go to the farm grade Anavar. And, you know, we won't go into the idea of the aesthetic component driving hardness. Like that's not it. Like we've all mentioned, gym performance is again our main measure of the total anabolic load, whether it's injectables, orals, anything like that. It's just we're using orals as a fast acting means to drive up that milligram total. So don't try to get lost in let us demystify these orals by this one does this and this one does this and this one does that, right? And now you think, well, that's when you end up with the cycle. You see that pro cycle that has like 4 different orals in it. And you're like, why did they have 4 different orals? Well, this one makes you hard and this one gets you full and this one helps with gym performance. Like they're not differentiating that much. So just simplify it to that and it'll make your compound stack design so much easier in assessing it and giving you good rationales for when and what you're using.
That was a beautiful conversation.
I think it went really well. I like it.
That was so good.
Yeah, well, I hope you all enjoyed it. Luke and I think we will wrap it up there.
Yeah, let's cut it there. That's good.
If you would reorder our PED top 5 list, put it down below if you're on YouTube, and you can say what is your worst to best compound selection. I feel like someone might throw in a D and P. We didn't cover that. So either way, I'd love to see your list. Leave them down below. Until next time, Luke and I will talk to you then.